You know, the great W.B. Du Bois, who was one of the grand truth tellers of the barbaric 20th century, he wrote a piece in Chicago Defender in June 26, 1945. He was just leaving San Francisco as he witnessed the founding of the United Nations. And he said, I foresee a third world war with the US trying to suppress Asia and put a stranglehold on Russia. It's 1945. And the priority right now of Washington elites is the attempt to suppress China with plans of a war against China and a stranglehold on Russia. Now, China and Russia have their own forms of domination and repression that we should not in any way downplay. We have to be morally consistent. I believe in being spiritually and morally consistent. But we also have to be honest about the context and the background conditions. So when you look at the United States that promised Gorbachev, NATO would not move 1 inch. And decades later, 13 former Soviet countries now part of NATO with missiles in Belarus and in Romania pointed toward Moscow. Now, if the United States empire had Russian or Chinese missiles in Canada or Mexico, they would be blown to smithereens the same day. That's how empires behave. I'm old enough to be around with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. We're right on the edge of nuclear exchange. Why? Because that's how empires behave. The United States is the mightiest empire in the history of the species. There's been 70 empires since the species emerged. The United States is 68. And empires are about, like Alexander the Great, conquest. It's about power. It's about subjugation. Now, the Russian Empire is an empire too, but it's very weak. There's no equivalence between the Russian Empire and the US Empire. There's no doubt about that. The invasion of Ukraine was criminal. No doubt about that. The same way the invasion of Iraq was criminal. The occupation, criminal. Empires do involve themselves in criminal activity, commit war crimes. But the provocation of the American empire through NATO, and NATO was an instrumentality of US global power, that it pushed the Russian Empire against the wall. They were promised that we would stop, and it kept getting further and further. It pushed them against the wall. That's why the war, in so many ways, is the proxy war, as you rightly say, between America and Russia, between the US Empire and the Russian Empire. Now, the Russian Empire has nuclear warheads, but there's no comparison in terms of the military might of the US Empire vis-a-vis the Russian Empire. And the precious Ukrainian brothers and sisters get killed, crushed in the middle. That's why I call for a ceasefire. We've got to stop the war. And then we got to come to the diplomatic table and say, look, bring in, not just from Ukraine and Russia, but we got to have a presidential US. Can you imagine if the US president comes in and says, I want to tell the truth about how the war came into being, and it begins with a critique of the American empire. Not because I'm anti-American, because I'm pro-truth. If it was wrong, I wouldn't say it. If it wasn't truthful, I wouldn't say it. And the same would be, of course, I've got my critiques of Putin and the Russians too, indeed. I've got my morality, indeed. But we bring in the Chinese, we bring in the African elites and others who want a ceasefire that would then begin a diplomatic process. And it would be, and of course, the Russian troops would have to leave. We'd have to talk about what kinds of properties and lands and would be given back to Ukraine. And then the United States would have to promise to pull back. And of course, I call for the disbanding of NATO, but that's a much longer project. I think we got to dismantle all these instrumentalities of the American empire. Because what is happening is, and this is where the issue of both Trump and Biden come into play, because with Trump, you're pushing the American empire toward its second civil war internally. With Biden, you're pushing toward a third world war externally, with nuclear exchange being a possibility, and the precious Ukrainians caught in the middle. I think the preoccupation right now of Biden and his foreign policy elites is still China. It really is. Even his internal project in terms of infrastructure and new kinds of jobs and so forth, which is fine, but it really is an attempt to, it's a second step toward preparing the country toward war with China, because it has to do with various forms of excluding Chinese technology, various forms of excluding access to Chinese resources. And that raises the question of the Third World War that Du Bois was talking about, suppression of Asia. Du Bois didn't say China, but he said suppression of Asia. This is 1945. This is before the Chinese Revolution. And he said the strangleholding of Russia. And so if you're anti-war and pro-humanity, and especially when you're pro-humanity, and again, as a Christian, I got my deep biases. I begin with the least of these. Those Sly Stone call everyday people. I begin with ordinary people, the language of James Cleveland, you see. And so therefore, I'm looking at the world through the lens of those Francis Fanon called the wretched of the earth. That's just who I am. And that's how I roll.